The Great Molasses Flood. On January 15, 1919, Boston's North End waterfront was busy with workers, horses, and freight cars moving through the industrial district. At 529 Commercial Street stood a massive steel storage tank owned by the Purity Distilling Company. The tank rose 50 feet high and 90 feet across, holding over 2 million gallons of crude molasses. It was a normal winter afternoon, unseasonably warm at 40 degrees. Workers moved through the streets below, unaware of what was about to happen. Just after 12:30 in the afternoon, the tank exploded. A wave of molasses 25 feet high burst outward at 35 miles per hour. The force ripped the steel tank apart and sent massive panels flying through the air. One piece of steel crushed the firehouse across the street. The wave smashed buildings, buckled elevated train tracks, and swept people off their feet. Horses and workers were thrown into the brown surge. The sound was described as a roar followed by a machine gun-like rattling as rivets shot through the air like bullets. But the cold weather made everything worse. The molasses was thick and viscous, more like wet concrete than liquid. Those caught in the wave could not swim or move their limbs. The sticky mass trapped victims in place, covering their faces and filling their mouths. A boy was swept onto the crest of the wave and carried down the street before being thrown against a building. Others were not as fortunate. 21 people drowned or suffocated in the molasses. The thick liquid prevented them from breathing, coating their airways and lungs. Rescuers struggled to reach victims because they could barely move through the waist-deep sludge. Some died pinned beneath debris, unable to call for help as the molasses hardened around them. Bodies were recovered over the following days, pulled from the sticky mass that had turned solid in the cold. The grinding machine. A 37-year-old maintenance engineer at a Kawasaki Heavy Industries factory in Akashi, Japan. He worked with industrial robots on the assembly line, machines designed to move car parts with mechanical precision. On July 4, 1981, one of the robots malfunctioned during its automated cycle. He was called to the floor to fix it. The machine had stopped mid-operation, its robotic arm frozen in place. It was a routine repair, something he had done many times before. The engineer entered the restricted safety zone around the robot. Company protocol required workers to fully shut down and lock out the machine before approaching it. He did not follow the complete procedure. He believed the robot was disabled. He moved closer to inspect the malfunction. The robotic arm suddenly reactivated. The arm swung with programmed force and struck him in the torso. It pushed him backward across the factory floor. He stumbled, tried to regain his footing, but the arm kept moving. It drove him toward a large gear grinding machine positioned directly behind him. The gears were still running, rotating at high speed. The engineer was pinned against the machine. The robotic arm held him in place with mechanical strength far beyond human capability. The grinding gears caught his body and began pulling him in. Metal teeth designed to shape industrial parts tore through flesh and bone. The robot's arm continued its programmed movement, pressing him deeper into the machinery. Co-workers heard the sound of the gears but could not see what was happening from their positions on the floor. By the time they reached the restricted area, it was too late. The engineer died from massive crushing and grinding trauma. He became the first person in recorded history to be killed by a robot. His death was classified as an industrial accident caused by improper safety lockout procedures. The wood chipper plot. A 54-year-old supervisor working on a land clearing project near Gympie, Australia. On November 12, 2017, he was managing a crew removing trees and brush from a remote property. The work required heavy machinery, including a large wood chipper designed to process branches and timber into mulch. It was isolated work, far from witnesses or passers-by. The supervisor worked alongside two men. That afternoon, the two men attacked the supervisor with an iron bar. They struck him repeatedly across the head and body until he collapsed. He was either unconscious or close to death when they dragged him toward the running wood chipper. The machine's feed mechanism was designed to pull in branches up to 12 inches thick and grind them into chips within seconds. They fed him into the chipper. The rotating blades and grinding mechanism tore through his body the same way it processed timber. Bone, tissue, and clothing were shredded and expelled as mulch from the output chute. The machine made no distinction between wood and flesh. Within minutes, there was almost nothing left to identify. The two men scattered the remains across the work site, mixing them with legitimate wood chips and debris. Hours later, a small portion of the supervisor's body was discovered in the chipper's output pile. Police were called to what initially appeared to be a workplace accident, but investigators found inconsistencies. Forensic examination revealed blunt force trauma to the recovered remains that occurred before the chipping. Blood evidence at the scene did not match an accidental fall into the machine. Gregory Roser and Peter Koenig were arrested and charged with murder. Both men were convicted. One man received a life sentence with a minimum of 18 years. The other received a life sentence with a minimum of 15 years. The chocolate vat. On December 14, 2016, A 24-year-old worker at a confectionery factory in Fedortsovo, Russia, was assigned to work near one of the facility's large mixing vats. These industrial mixers were used to blend molten chocolate before it was molded into candy bars and other products. The vat she worked near held hundreds of gallons of liquid chocolate, heated to maintain its flowing consistency. Large mechanical mixing blades rotated continuously inside to keep the chocolate from solidifying. The worker was either pouring ingredients into the vat or had dropped her mobile phone into the mixture. She leaned over the edge to retrieve it or add materials. She lost her balance and fell forward into the open vat. The molten chocolate was hot but not scalding enough to cause instant death. She went under the surface of the thick brown liquid. The rotating mixer blades were still running at full speed. They were designed to blend heavy chocolate mixtures and operated with significant mechanical force. She was pulled downward by the rotating mechanism. The blade struck her body repeatedly as she struggled in the viscous liquid. Co-workers heard screaming coming from inside the vat. They rushed over and tried to stop the machine, but the mixing blades had already caused severe damage. The industrial mixer continued processing her body the same way it processed chocolate ingredients. Bone and tissue were torn apart by the rotating blades designed to blend dense materials. By the time workers managed to shut down the equipment, she had been minced by the machinery. The entire vat had to be drained to recover what remained. The worker died from blunt force trauma and lacerations caused by the industrial mixing blades. Factory officials were later investigated for inadequate safety barriers around open machinery. The meat blender. A 24-year-old sanitation worker at a meat processing plant in Clackamas, Oregon. His job involved cleaning the facility's industrial equipment after production shifts ended. On April 26, 2013, he was assigned to clean a large meat blender used to mix ground beef and other products. The machine was 8 feet long and 4 feet wide with rotating auger blades designed to thoroughly blend thousands of pounds of meat. Standard safety protocol required the machine to be locked out and tagged before anyone entered it for cleaning. The worker climbed inside the blender to scrub the interior surfaces and blades. The machine had not been properly locked out. He was scrubbing the metal walls when the blender suddenly activated. The rotating augers and blades began spinning at operational speed. He was caught immediately by the moving machinery. Co-workers in the facility heard screaming coming from inside the blender. They ran toward the machine and saw what was happening. They tried to reach the emergency shutoff controls, but the blender was already pulling him deeper into its mechanism. The blades designed to grind and mix meat operated with relentless mechanical force. His body was drawn into the rotating augers. The screaming continued as the machinery tore through flesh and bone. Workers managed to stop the machine, but it was too late. The blender had processed the worker the same way it processed meat during normal operations. The auger blades had caused what the medical examiner later described as blunt force injuries and chopping wounds across his entire body. He died inside the machine from massive trauma inflicted by the grinding and mixing mechanism. The worker bled to death from injuries sustained in the meat blender. The plant was later cited for failing to implement proper lockout and tagout safety procedures. The Pemberton Mill collapse. On January 10, 1860, the Pemberton Mill in Lawrence, Massachusetts employed over 900 workers in its 5-story textile factory. Most were women and children who operated the looms and spinning machines. The building was only 7 years old, but had been constructed with substandard materials and poor engineering. That afternoon, workers filled every floor as machines ran at full capacity. At 4:45, without warning, the entire structure collapsed. The floors pancaked downward, crushing machinery and workers into a mangled heap of bricks, timber, and iron. Over 600 people were trapped in the rubble. Rescue efforts began immediately. Workers and townspeople rushed to the site and started pulling survivors from the wreckage. They worked through the evening by lamplight, carefully removing debris to reach those pinned beneath. Voices called out from deep within the ruins. Some were injured but alive, waiting to be freed. The work was slow and dangerous. Every beam removed risked causing another collapse. Hours into the rescue operation, someone accidentally knocked over a lantern. The oil spilled onto cotton fabric scattered throughout the debris. Fire ignited instantly. Flames spread through the wreckage with terrifying speed, fed by the massive quantities of cotton, wood, and machine oil mixed into the ruins. The fire became an inferno within minutes. Rescuers were forced to step back from the heat. Those they had been working to free were now beyond reach. Screams came from people trapped beneath beams and machinery as fire surrounded them. One man, pinned in place with no hope of escape, took a piece of metal and cut his own throat rather than burn to death. Others had no choice but to endure the flames. The fire consumed dozens of workers who had survived the initial collapse. In total, 145 people died in the Pemberton Mill disaster. Many of them burned alive while rescuers watched helplessly from only feet away. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.